In this nugget, you and I are going to walk through the steps to deploy the vCenter server appliance as a virtual machine on one of our ESXi hosts. Let's begin. We're going to use this PC right here, which is on the 192.168.1 network. It could be either the machine running VMware workstation or another computer that has reachability to that network. And we're going to do a couple things. One, from this computer, I want to verify that DNS is working, that it can resolve the name of vCSA.nuglab.local to the IP address of 192.168.1.112. And I also want to verify that reverse lookups are also working, which would imply that I have not only an A record, but also that I've got a pointer record for reverse lookup. And then once we verify that DNS is working, we're going to install the plugin on this PC, and then we'll click on vcsa-setup.html, and that will walk us through the deployment of this vCenter server appliance as a virtual machine on the hypervisor on the ESXi host that we choose to put it on. So let's bring out a command prompt. This is from the PC that I'll be doing the deployment from, and let's use nslookup. And we'll type in the host name of vcsa.nuglab.local, press enter, and we have a failure. And the failure is me, because I typed in vSCA as opposed to vCSA, and that's why it couldn't be resolved, because I don't have that name inside of DNS. So let's go ahead and do a nslookup once again. But this time we'll type in vcsa.nuglab.local, press enter, and sure enough, that resolved to .112. Perfect. So we'll do nslookup once more, and this time we'll put in the IP address of 192.168.1.112 and verify whether or not the reverse lookup worked. And sure enough, right here it came back with the host name of vcsa.nuglab.local. That's great. Here on the AD server, which is also running our DNS services, let's go to Tools, and from the drop down we'll select DNS. Inside of DNS Manager, I just want to show you where we would go to create the pointer record if we didn't already have one. So under the forward lookup zone, under nuglab.local, here we have the vcsa.nuglab.local at 192.168.1.112. That's great. And if we go to the reverse lookup zones, I've got a reverse lookup zone for the 192.168.1 subnet. And here's a pointer record for vcsa.nuglab.local. Now, if in your lab environment you do not have a reverse lookup zone, you can simply create one. You'd right-click on reverse lookup zones, click on new zone, and then you'd simply follow the wizard and specify that you want a reverse lookup zone for the 192.168.1 network. And then once it exists, you can then create a pointer record for your vCSA host. Another option is that after you create the zone, if it didn't exist, you could go back to your forward zone. You could delete the vCSA, recreate it, and when you create a new A record, there's also a little checkbox that says, hey, by the way, do you want to create a pointer record as well? If you check that box and create a new A record, you'll get the A record as well as the pointer record. So DNS appears to be 100% ready for our deployment of the vCenter server appliance. Our next step is to install the plugin on this computer, this Windows computer that I'm going to use to deploy the vCenter server appliance. So here I've got this D drive, and that D drive represents the image that I got from VMware for the vCenter server appliance. And so I'm going to expand that, look at the contents of that ISO image. And then there's a folder called vCSA. I'm going to expand that. And here's the VMware Client Integration plugin. And then to install the plugin, you simply double click on the VMware Client Integration plugin. So on this computer that I'm currently using, I've already got that plugin installed, so it's ready to go. So then our second step after the plugin is installed is to click on the vCSA-setup.html that is also included on that ISO image for the vCenter server appliance. So if we go up back to the parent folder on that image, Here we have the vCSA-setup.html. We'll simply double click on that to launch it. So now to continue with the vCenter appliance install, we'd simply click on Install. We'll click on the checkbox to accept all the terms of the license agreement. We'll click on Next. Now it's asking us for the fully qualified domain name or IP address of the ESXi host that is going to be used as the hypervisor to support this vCSA virtual machine. So the host that we're going to use is esxi-1.nuglab.local. The username we're going to use is root. And the password is going to be the password on that ESXi host that we configured for root when we deployed that ESXi host. So I've supplied the password, and I'll click on Next. Now we have a warning regarding an untrusted certificate that's being presented to us by that ESXi host. And once again, that ESXi host is doing the best it can. It has a self-signed certificate that it's presenting. So if we wanted to, we could go over to the DCUI and verify whether or not the SHA-1 thumbprint presented here matches the SHA-1 thumbprint seen at the Direct Console user interface. And if it does, which in this case it does because we're talking to that same device, we know we're connected to and working with the correct ESXi host. And because in a production environment, we probably would want to verify that we are talking to the right device, let's go back over to the Direct Console user interface of ESXi1 and just verify the SHA-1 thumbprint that's shown there as well. So we could spot check this or we could read the whole thing, but let's just take the first 4 characters, 4B12, and the last 4 characters, 9B24, and verify those in our lab environment against the ESXi host itself. So here at ESXi1, we'll press the F2 key, and then we'll authenticate here at the DCUI by supplying our password. And then we're going to use the down arrow key several times until we get down to View Support Information. And here it's showing us the SSL SHA-1 thumbprint, and it starts with 4B12, which I'm looking at my notes, matches the other side. It ends in 9B24, which also matches. So now that we know that we're connected to the correct ESXi host, we can go ahead and click on Yes here, back at the installer, and we're being authenticated, and it's asking us for an appliance name. And let's go ahead and call this vCSA. Now this is asking us to set the root password on the vCenter server appliance. So I'm going to use, in the lab environment, I'm going to use Nugget !23, and in a production environment, it probably would not, I repeat, not be a great idea to use the same password everywhere. Because that way, if it's compromised at one location, the individual who's compromised that password could then use it at multiple locations. However, in a lab environment, it's going to be simpler for me to remember my password if I use the same one everywhere in my lab environment. So I'll hit the tab key and we'll confirm the password. And then we'll click on Next to continue. Next, it's explaining that we can do an embedded platform services controller, or we can have an external platform services controller. And in our lab environment, because we're only going to have one vCenter server and we want one virtual machine to handle both the platform services as well as the vCenter, we're going to use an embedded platform services controller, which is the default option here for the deployment. So with that selected, we'll go ahead and click on Next. Next, it's asking us if we want to create or join a single sign-on domain. Now this is not, I repeat, this is not your Active Directory infrastructure, which we will be integrating into later. This is just for vSphere. So regarding this vSphere SSO and the username of administrator, what password do we want to use for administrator? So I'm going to supply a password for the administrator of this single sign-on domain for vSphere. And I'm going to confirm it. Next, it's asking for an SSO domain name. Now, also, just be aware right here that it says make sure that it's different, a different domain than your Active Directory domain. We don't want them to be the same exact names. So I am going to use vSphere.local, which has been the default domain on previous iterations of the vCenter Server appliance. And I'm going to call this Site 1. And then we'll click on Next. Next, it's asking us about the story of Goldilocks and the three bears, except this time there's four. We have tiny, small, medium, and large, and this basically determines how much RAM and CPU and disk space is going to be needed or required and allocated for this virtual machine. And in our lab environment, we're going to have less than 10, very likely 2 ESXi hosts. So we'll go for tiny to save on resources, and we'll click on Next. Next, it's gone out and identified the data store. And a data store is the representation of storage that an ESXi host has that can be used to store a virtual machine's files. So currently on ESXi 1, we've got one data store. It was the one that was installed by default when we deployed the ESXi host. The file type is VMFS, and that stands for the Virtual Machine File System, and the current capacity is 92.5 gigabytes. The other thing we're going to do here is we're going to click on this box that says Enable Thin Disk Mode. And the concept of thin provisioning is just like it was on VMware Workstation, where the actual disk storage that's taken up is only the amount of disk storage that the device is actually using. So if a device is given a disk of, for example, 50 gigabytes, but it's only using 20, it only ties up 20 gigs on the physical disk as opposed to the entire 50. So we'll check that box just to get the most out of our data store on ESXi 1. And then we'll click on Next. The next question is, do we want to use the embedded database or do we want to use an Oracle database? Now, if you select Oracle database, you'll need to have an Oracle database that is currently set up and reachable from this vCenter server. For our lab environment, I'm going to use the embedded database, which requires no additional configuration by the administrator. So we'll go ahead and select that and then click on Next. Next, it's asking us for this virtual machine, for this vCenter server appliance, what network do you want to put this vCenter server appliance in? And by default, we've got one network that's being created and provided by our ESXi host. And that is a network that came by default called VM Network. It's our only choice here, so we'll select it. IP address family is IPv4. We'll select that. Network type is DHCP or static. We'll select static. And now we're going to specify the IP address that we want to use for this vCenter server appliance, which is 192.168.1.112. And then for the system name, because it is working in DNS, we're going to go ahead and call it vcsa.nuglab.local. And then for the subnet mask, we're going to give it a 24-bit mask, which in dotted decimal would be 255.255.255.0. And if you'd like to brush up a little bit on IPv4 and IPv4 subnetting, please feel free to check out our IPv4 subnetting course right here at CBT Nuggets. The default gateway that we're going to have this device use is 192.168.1.1. That's a real router that I have on the management network. And then for DNS, I'm going to use 192.168.1.111. That's our Active Directory server that has DNS running. And I'm going to put a comma in. I'm going to add also 8.8.8.8 as an alternate DNS server. And then if we scroll down a little bit more, it's asking us regarding time synchronization. Do we want to use NTP servers or do we want to synchronize the appliance time with the ESXi host that we're currently running on? So the choice is yours. Because we are connected to the internet and we do have access out to the internet, we could use some public NTP servers and those would work as well. And there's a lot of great reasons why we would want synchronized time to be accurate between our vCenter server and the ESXi hosts, including the fact that we want single sign-on to work consistently well. We want our certificates to work. And if time is way off, we might have a device that thinks the certificate is no longer valid because it's out of a date range. And it's also great for logging. So we can have accurate timestamps, especially when we're cross-referencing events across multiple devices. And if we want to enable SSH to this vCenter server appliance, we could check the box that would allow that to happen as well. And with those elements set, we'll click on Next. So it gives us a summary here of what it's about to do, and then we'll click on Finish to go ahead and deploy it. And I've got an error. Wait a second, we tested DNS, couldn't resolve hostname. And oh my gosh, it is not working. I am shocked. So maybe I had a typo in that process. Let's do it again a second time. We'll do this much, much quicker. And what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to leave off the 8888 as an alternate DNS server. I'm just going to give it the one DNS server that we have internal to our network. I'm going to say synchronize time with the ESXi host and enable SSH and click on Next. So there's our summarization, and we'll click on Finish. And it's now downloading and deploying the appliance. So I don't know if I had a typo on one of the latter screens in our first attempt, but it is working now. So as the saying goes, if at first you don't succeed, try again. And through the magic of editing, I'm not going to make us watch this entire deployment, but when it's finished, we'll join back up, and then we'll take a look at the results. And the installation is complete. Wahoo! I don't know exactly how long that took because I went downstairs, made some popcorn, and did some other stuff for a few minutes. So it could have been anywhere from about 5 to 30 minutes because that's how long I was gone. But now we can log in to this URL, https:// the URL of our vCenter server appliance / vSphere-client. And we can log on as administrator at vSphere.local. And we set the password for that during the deployment. So let's try it. We'll go to vcsa.nuglab.local / vSphere-client using HTTPS. We're also using a self-signed certificate at the vCenter server, so that's okay as well as far as the warning regarding our certificate. So we'll click on Advanced and then click on Proceed to vcsa.nuglab.local because we know it's a self-signed certificate at this point. And our next step would be to log on. So we'll log on as administrator at vSphere.local with the password that we specified. And then we'll click on Login. And here, my friend, we're looking at the VMware vSphere web client. And it's from this pane of glass that we're going to do the management and administration of most of our vSphere environment. In this nugget, we have deployed the vCenter server appliance by using the ISO that we downloaded from VMware.com as part of our vSphere evaluation. We installed the plugin on our local Windows computer that we are going to use to deploy the vCenter server. Then we clicked on vCSA-setup.html and we answered the questions to deploy a vCenter server appliance as a virtual machine on an ESXi host. And now for the assessment check. Question number 1. What is the name of the file that starts the wizard that allows us to deploy the vCenter server appliance? And if you're saying, Keith, I know it's vCSA-setup.html, you'd be absolutely correct. Question number 2. Should the vSphere SSO domain be the same as our Active Directory domain? And the answer is no. Please make sure there is a difference of at least one character between your single sign-on domain for vSphere and your single sign-on domain for Microsoft Active Directory. If you're not using Active Directory, it's a moot point. Question number 3. Where do you go to get the ISO image for the vCenter server appliance? And the answer to that one is Bueller? Anyone? It is VMware.com. And as part of the vSphere evaluation, the vCenter server appliance ISO is also part of that download. Thanks for joining me for this nugget. Your homework assignment in your lab environment is to deploy the vCenter server appliance as we did in this nugget, but in your own lab environment. And I look forward to seeing you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.